Picture this: a high school gym buzzing with the kind of chaotic energy only a science fair can muster. Kids darting around, posters teetering on flimsy tables, and the faint hum of nervous excitement in the air. I'm just a guy, a 32-year-old, English and Spanish teacher, weaving through this maze of youthful ambition, trying not to trip over a stray extension cord. My name's not important. Let's just say I'm the kind of teacher who's more comfortable grading essays than dodging teenage scientists. But today, I'm about to become the unwitting star of a disaster that'll haunt me for years. Buckle up, because this is the story of how I, in one spectacularly clumsy moment, turned a science fair into a caffeine-soaked catastrophe. It all started innocently enough. The gym was a kaleidoscope of color and noise, like a carnival midway stuffed into a basketball court. Tables groaned under the weight of trifold posters, bubbling beakers, and the occasional potato battery that looked like it might actually work. Students were in full-on hustle mode, tweaking their displays, practicing their pitches, and probably praying their projects wouldn't spontaneously combust before the judges arrived. I was there to check on my English class kids, a pair I'd been hyping up for weeks because their project sounded legitimately cool. And trust me, when you teach literature and verb conjugations all day, cool is not a word you throw around lightly. I spotted their table across the gym, nestled between a model volcano that looked suspiciously like it was made of Play-Doh and a kid explaining photosynthesis with a plant that was definitely already dead. My students, let's call them Mia and Jake, were the real deal. Mia, 16, was all confidence, her VR headset gleaming like a futuristic crown. Jake, 17, stood beside her, clipboard in hand, pen poised, looking like he'd just stepped out of a NASA control room. Their project? Something about the nervous system, which, in hindsight, should have been my first red flag. Anything involving my nerves was bound to end badly. "Hey, Mr. T," Mia called out, waving me over with a grin that said she knew I was out of my depth. "You gotta try this." I ambled over, trying to play it cool. "What's the deal?" I asked, eyeing the VR headset like it was a ticking time bomb. I'm not exactly a tech wizard. My idea of cutting edge is a whiteboard marker that doesn't squeak. But these two were my students, and I'd promised to support their project. Plus, I'll admit, I was curious. How often do you get to strap on a VR headset and let teenagers mess with your brain? Jake, ever the serious scientist, launched into their pitch. "We're studying fight-or-flight responses," he said, his voice steady like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. "The VR simulates a high-stress environment, and we measure your physical reactions, heart rate, flinches, that kind of thing. Want to give it a go?" I hesitated. I'm a grown man. I've faced down stacks of ungraded essays and parent-teacher conferences. How scary could a high school VR demo be? "Sure," I said, shrugging like I wasn't already regretting it. "Hook me up." Mia handed me the headset, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Just relax, Mr. T, it's totally safe." Famous last words, right? I slipped the headset on, and the gym vanished. Suddenly, I was in a dark, eerie forest, the kind of place where you'd expect to hear a werewolf howl. The graphics were unnervingly real. Twisted trees, fog curling around my ankles, and a distant rustling that made my skin prickle. I could hear Mia and Jake's muffled voices outside, but they felt a million miles away. "Okay, just walk forward," Mia's voice crackled through the headset. "And don't freak out, don't freak out." Easy for her to say. I took a tentative step, my hands groping the air like I was auditioning for a zombie movie. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches snapping somewhere in the distance. My heart was already picking up speed, and I'm pretty sure Jake was scribbling furiously on his clipboard. I tried to laugh it off, muttering, "This is fine, totally fine," but my voice sounded thin, like I was trying to convince myself. Then it happened. A shadow lunged out of the fog, a grotesque, toothy creature with glowing eyes barreling straight for me. I don't know what it was supposed to be, zombie, alien, demon dog, but my brain didn't care about specifics. It screamed, "Danger!" and my body obeyed. I flailed, arms windmilling, legs stumbling backward like I was trying to outrun a tidal wave. In the VR world, I was dodging a monster. In the real world, I was a human wrecking ball. I heard a crash, a chorus of gasps, and Mia yelling, "Mr. T, stop!" I ripped off the headset. My glasses skewed across my face like I'd just survived a bar fight. The gym swam back into focus, but it wasn't the same gym I'd left seconds ago. It was a crime scene, and I was the culprit. Before I tell you what I saw, let me pause for a second. Have you ever had one of those moments where time slows down and you realize you've just done something so monumentally stupid you can't take it back? That was me, standing there, headset dangling from my hand, staring at the wreckage of my own making. And trust me, it gets worse. I looked down and there it was. A table, or what used to be a table, now tilted at a drunken angle. Cups were scattered across the floor, their contents pooling into a sad brown lake. The air smelled like a Starbucks that had just been hit by a tornado. Two kids stood frozen nearby, their faces a mix of shock and horror. One of them, a lanky boy who'd managed to leap out of the way, was clutching a clipboard like it was his lifeline. The other, one of my ESL students, wasn't so lucky. He was soaked, his shirt clinging to him, dripping coffee like he'd just lost a battle with a barista. This wasn't just any table. This was another group's science fair project, a chemistry experiment about dilution using coffee and milk. They'd set up rows of cups, each one carefully measured to show different concentrations, like a caffeinated art installation. People were supposed to sip them, compare the flavors, and marvel at the science of it all. Instead, thanks to me, their project was a soggy mess, and the science fair hadn't even started yet. I stood there, my crooked glasses fogging up with embarrassment, muttering, "Oh no, oh no, oh no," like a broken record. The kids' faces told me everything I needed to know. The lanky one looked like he was calculating how many hours of work I'd just destroyed. The soaked kid, my student, just stared at me, his eyes wide with betrayal. I teach him English, for crying out loud. I'm supposed to be his guide, his mentor, not the guy who turns his science fair dreams into a coffee-stained nightmare. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. I was just..." But what could I say? I was just trying to survive a virtual monster. I was just too clumsy to exist in a gym full of fragile experiments. Every word felt useless. I glanced at Mia and Jake, who were hovering nearby, looking like they wanted to disappear. Mia's VR headset was still in my hand, and I set it down like it was radioactive. Jake's clipboard was frozen mid-scribble, his scientist persona shattered by the chaos I'd unleashed. The worst part? This wasn't just about the spilled coffee. These kids had poured weeks into their project. They'd probably stayed up late, argued over measurements, and practiced their presentation until it was perfect, and I'd ruined it in seconds. The science fair was tonight, and they'd need to start from scratch, new coffee, new milk, new everything. I could already imagine them hauling pots and jugs to the gym, racing against the clock while I stood there, useless, drowning in guilt. I wanted to fix it, to wave a magic wand and make it all okay. But there was no wand, just me, a teacher who'd turned a science fair into a disaster movie. The other students in the gym were starting to stare, their whispers buzzing like flies. I could feel the weight of their judgment, and worse, the weight of my own failure. I'd let these kids down, and I didn't know how to make it right. But here's the thing, this story isn't over yet. What happened next pushed me to confront my mistake in ways I never expected. Stick around, because if you think this was bad, wait until you hear how I tried to salvage the wreckage. Spoiler alert, it's not pretty. So there I was, standing in the wreckage of my own stupidity, the gym around me humming with the kind of stunned silence that follows a car crash. Coffee pooled at my feet, cups rolled across the floor like tiny tumbleweeds, and the eyes of every student in the room burned into me. I'd just obliterated a science fair project. Coffee and milk meticulously measured, now a sad, soggy mess. And the clock was ticking. The science fair was tonight, and I, the bumbling English teacher, was the villain of this story. But if you think the worst was over, oh, you're in for a ride. This is where things got messy, figuratively and literally. Let me set the scene. The gym was still a circus, but now it had a new main attraction. Me, the guy who'd turned a chemistry project into a caffeine crime scene. My glasses were still crooked, my face hot with shame, and my ESL student, let's call him Diego, stood there dripping coffee like a human espresso machine. His partner, the lanky kid I'll name Ethan, was clutching his clipboard, his jaw tight like he was mentally rewriting his college application essay to include survived teacher-induced disaster. My own students, Mia and Jake, were frozen behind their VR table, their nervous system project now the least of anyone's concerns. And me? I was spiraling, my brain screaming, "Fix this, you idiot," while my mouth just kept spitting out useless apologies. "I'm so sorry," I said again, my voice wobbling like a bad karaoke singer. "I'll help, I swear. We'll get new coffee, new milk, whatever you need." But Diego just blinked at me, his wet shirt clinging to his skinny frame. And Ethan muttered something under his breath that I'm pretty sure wasn't "no problem, teach." The other students in the gym were starting to move again, some whispering, some outright laughing, and I could feel the weight of their stares like a physical thing. I wanted to crawl under a table and hide, but teachers don't get to do that. Teachers have to stand tall, even when they've just turned a science fair into a sitcom disaster. I took a deep breath, trying to channel some kind of adult authority, and clapped my hands together. "Okay, let's fix this," I said, louder than I felt. "Ethan, Diego, tell me what you need, I'll make this right." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his clipboard still gripped like a shield. "We need 4 pots of coffee," he said, his voice flat, "and a gallon of milk, and new cups. And we need it before tonight because the judges are coming and our project is literally ruined." Diego nodded, his expression a mix of resignation and quiet fury. "I teach him English, help him navigate a new language, a new country. And now, I doused him in coffee and tanked his science fair grade. Great job, Mr. T. I turned to Mia and Jake, who were hovering like guilty bystanders. "You two," I said, pointing. "You're helping. This is a team effort now." Mia's eyes widened, but Jake just nodded, his scientist facade cracking under the pressure. I didn't blame them. None of this was their fault. Not really. But their VR monster had turned me into a flailing disaster, so they were conscripted into the cleanup crew. Fair's fair. The next hour was a blur of frantic activity, the kind of chaos that makes you wonder how you ended up here. I sent Jake to the school cafeteria to beg for coffee. Any coffee, didn't matter if it was decaf or that sludge they serve at faculty meetings. Mia and I raced to the nearest dollar store, my car rattling with every bump as I tried to explain the situation to her without sounding like a complete lunatic. "It was the VR," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "That thing scared the hell out of me." Mia, to her credit, didn't laugh, but I could see the corners of her mouth twitching. "You really went for it, Mr. T," she said. And I groaned. "Yeah, went for it right into someone else's project." At the store, we loaded up on milk, 2 gallons just to be safe, and enough disposable cups to supply a small coffee shop. The cashier raised an eyebrow as we dumped our haul on the counter. "Science fair," I muttered, and she nodded like that explained everything. Back at school, Jake had managed to scrounge up 3 pots of coffee from the cafeteria, though he warned me one of them smelled like it had been sitting since last semester. Ethan and Diego were already at their table, mopping up the mess with paper towels, their faces set in grim determination. I handed over the milk and cups, feeling like a kid offering a crumpled homework assignment to a disappointed teacher. "Okay," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "We've got the supplies, let's rebuild this thing." Ethan sighed, but he took the milk and started measuring, his hands steady despite the chaos. Diego, still damp but drying, worked beside him, his movements precise but quiet. I could tell he was still mad, and I didn't blame him. I hovered nearby, trying to help without getting in the way, which is harder than it sounds when you're a 32-year-old man with a knack for breaking things. As we worked, I started to piece together the scope of their project. It wasn't just coffee and milk. It was a study of dilution and concentration, a clever way to show how molecules interact. They'd spent weeks testing ratios, brewing coffee at different strengths, and calculating how milk changed the flavor and chemistry. It was impressive, the kind of thing that could win awards, and I'd turned it into a puddle. The guilt was a physical ache, like a stone lodged in my chest. I kept glancing at Diego, wondering how I could make this up to him. A better grade. In English? A lifetime supply of coffee? Nothing felt like enough. But here's where things took a turn. Just as we were starting to get the table back in order, the gym doors swung open, and in walked Principal Carter. Now, if you've ever met a principal, you know they have a sixth sense for disaster. Carter's eyes locked onto our corner of the gym like a hawk spotting a wounded mouse. She strode over, her heels clicking on the polished floor, and surveyed the scene. Me, covered in coffee stains. Diego, still slightly soggy. Ethan, measuring milk like his life depended on it, and Mia and Jake trying to look busy while avoiding eye contact. "What's going on here?" Carter asked, her voice calm but sharp, the kind of tone that makes you feel like you're 12 years old again. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words tangled up. There was a VR headset, and I got startled, and I gestured helplessly at the table, the cups, the lingering coffee smell. Carter's eyebrows climbed higher with every word, and I could feel the gym shrinking around me. Ethan, bless him, stepped in. "It was an accident, Principal Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Mr. T was helping with another project, and he bumped our table. We're fixing it now." He didn't throw me under the bus, didn't mention the flailing or the VR monster. I could have hugged him, but that would have made things even weirder. Carter nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "I see. Well, I expect this to be resolved before the fair starts tonight. The judges are expecting a professional event." She turned to me, and I swear her eyes said, "You owe me." Then she walked away, leaving me to exhale a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about coffee or milk or even the science fair. It was about these kids, Ethan, Diego, Mia, Jake, and what they'd learned from this mess. They were handling it, stepping up, working together even after I'd thrown a wrench into their plans. And me? I was learning too, about humility, about owning your mistakes, about how to keep going when you've made a fool of yourself in front of a gym full of teenagers. But don't think this is the end. We were racing against time, and the science fair was looming like a storm cloud. Would we pull it off, or would my clumsiness ruin everything for good? Stick around, because the next part of this disaster is where things really get wild. Here's the thing about disasters. They don't just end. They ripple, like a stone dropped in a pond, sending waves of chaos in every direction. I was standing, in that gym, surrounded by coffee-stained cups and the ghosts of my own clumsiness, trying to piece together a science fair project I'd single-handedly destroyed. The clock was ticking, the judges were coming, and I, the English teacher who'd flailed his way into infamy, was neck-deep in a redemption mission that felt like herding cats in a hurricane. But just when I thought I had a handle on the mess, life threw me a curveball that made me question everything. Hold on tight, because this is where the story takes a turn into the kind of chaos even I couldn't have predicted. Let's rewind a bit. The gym was a war zone of teenage ambition, with students scurrying around their projects like ants rebuilding a collapsed colony. Ethan and Diego, the coffee and milk duo, were back at their table, measuring out new batches of their dilution, experiment with a focus that put my essay grading sessions to shame. Diego, still a little damp but soldiering on, poured milk with the precision of a surgeon. Ethan, clipboard in hand, was calling out ratios like a general directing troops. My students Mia and Jake were pitching in, Mia organizing cups and Jake double-checking the coffee pots which still smelled vaguely of regret. And me? I was the awkward cheerleader, trying to help without breaking anything else. My guilt a constant hum in the background. We'd managed to secure the supplies, milk, cups, and some questionable cafeteria coffee, and the table was starting to look like a science project again. I was even starting to feel a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, we could pull this off before the science fair kicked off in a few hours. But hope, as I've learned, is a fragile thing, and mine was about to get stomped on. It started with a small problem, the kind that sneaks up on you like a paper cut. Ethan, who'd been a rock through this whole ordeal, suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on one of the coffee pots. "This isn't right," he muttered, sniffing the liquid like a bloodhound. I leaned in, catching a whiff of something that smelled less like coffee and more like burnt regret. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach already sinking. "This coffee," Ethan said, his voice tight. "It's decaf. We can't use decaf. Our whole project is about caffeine concentration, and decaf throws off the entire experiment." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw something like panic in his eyes. Diego, catching the vibe, stopped pouring milk and stared at the pot like it had personally betrayed him. Mia and Jake exchanged a glance, and I could feel the fragile teamwork we'd built starting to crack. I tried to stay calm, channeling every teacher trick I knew. "Okay, no problem," I said, clapping my hands together like an overly enthusiastic camp counselor. "We'll get new coffee, real coffee. There's gotta be some in the teacher's lounge, right?" But even as I said it, I remembered the lounge coffee, weak, watery stuff that tasted like it had been brewed in a sock. Ethan shook his head. "It has to be the same brand, same strength. We standardized everything for the experiment. If we change it now, the data's useless." The weight of that hit me like a punch. This wasn't just about replacing coffee. It was about preserving the integrity of their work, the weeks they'd spent perfecting every detail. I'd already ruined their project once. I couldn't let them down again. "Where'd you get the original coffee?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "My mom's stash," Diego said quietly, his first full sentence since the incident. "It's this special blend she gets from a shop downtown. We used it because it's consistent." He looked at me, his eyes steady but tired, and I felt that stone of guilt in my chest grow heavier. Diego's family had moved here a year ago, and I knew from our English classes that his mom worked long hours. That coffee wasn't just coffee, it was a piece of their home, a small luxury they'd shared for this project. And I'd spilled it all over the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the clock ticking in my head. "Okay, downtown it is. I'll go get it. You guys keep setting up and I'll be back with the right coffee before you know it." Ethan raised an eyebrow, skeptical but too exhausted to argue. Diego just nodded, his face unreadable. Mia and Jake offered to come with me, but I waved them off. "Stay here, help Ethan and Diego, I've got this." Famous last words, right? The drive downtown was a blur of traffic and self-loathing. I kept replaying the moment I'd crashed into that table, my arms flailing like a cartoon character, the cups flying like they'd been launched by a catapult. I could still see Diego's face, the shock and betrayal in his eyes, and it made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had to fix this, not just for the science fair, but for him, for all of them. The coffee shop was one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and baristas who looked like they moonlighted as poets. I burst in, probably looking like a caffeinated maniac, and explained my situation to the guy behind the counter. "I need this exact blend," I said, holding up the crumpled bag Diego had given me, which miraculously still had the shop's logo. The barista, sporting a man bun and an expression of mild amusement, nodded. "Sure, man, but we're low on that one. I can give you what's left, but it might not be enough for whatever you're doing." My heart sank. "How much do you have?" He checked, and it was barely half of what we needed. I bought it anyway, along with a similar blend he swore was close enough, and prayed Ethan's scientific precision wouldn't notice the difference. As I raced back to school, the bags of coffee rattling in the passenger seat, I tried to convince myself this would work. But deep down, I knew close enough wasn't going to cut it. Back at the gym, things were tense. Ethan and Diego had made progress, the table now lined with neat rows of cups, but the air was thick with frustration. I handed over the coffee, explaining the situation as delicately as I could. "They were out of the exact blend, but this one's really similar," I said, holding up the bags like a peace offering. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might actually cry. "Similar?" he repeated, his voice low. "Mr. T, this project is about precision. If the coffee's different, our results are compromised. The judges will tear us apart." Diego, who'd been quiet, spoke up. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll make it work. We have to." I looked at him surprised and saw something new in his eyes. Not anger, not resignation, but determination. It was the kind of resilience I'd seen in his English essays, the way he tackled new words and ideas despite the odds. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about coffee or science fairs. It was about these kids proving they could rise above my mistake. We got to work, blending the coffees as best we could, Ethan grumbling but adjusting his calculations like a pro. Mia and Jake hovered, offering moral support and the occasional bad joke to lighten the mood. But just as we were starting to find a rhythm, the gym doors swung open again, and in walked the science teacher, Mrs. Larson. She was a legend, the kind of teacher who could make chemistry sound like a thriller novel, and her presence was like a spotlight on our little disaster. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the table, the cups, the slightly panicked faces. I opened my mouth to explain, but Diego beat me to it. "We had an accident," he said, his English clear and steady. "But we're fixing it. Mr. T's helping." Mrs. Larson raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she nodded at Diego and Ethan. "I expect great things from you two. Don't let me down." Then she walked away, leaving me both relieved and terrified. That's when it hit me. The science fair wasn't just a grade or a showcase. It was these kids' chance to shine, to show what they could do. And I'd almost taken that away, but they were fighting back, and I had to keep up. The judges were coming, the clock was ticking, and we were still one wrong move from another disaster. Want to know what happened when the judges finally arrived? Let's just say, the chaos wasn't over yet. Stick around for the final part, because this story's about to hit its wildest turn. You ever have one of those moments where the universe seems to hold its breath, waiting to see if you'll pull off a miracle or crash and burn spectacularly? That was me, standing in a high school gym that smelled like coffee and regret, surrounded by teenagers who were counting on me to fix the disaster I'd caused. The science fair was about to start. The judges were circling like sharks, and I, the English teacher who'd turned a chemistry project into a caffeinated catastrophe, was one wrong move from making things even worse. But this is where it all comes together, the moment where chaos, guilt, and a little bit of hope collide. Buckle up, because this is the story of how I faced the music and learned something I'll never forget. The gym was transformed. Gone was the frantic hustle of setup. Now it was a polished showcase with posters gleaming under fluorescent lights and students standing tall beside their projects. The air buzzed with nervous energy, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Ethan and Diego's table was back in fighting shape, rows of cups lined up like soldiers, each filled with carefully measured coffee and milk. It wasn't perfect. The coffee was a Frankenstein blend of the original and a close enough substitute, but it was theirs, rebuilt from the ashes of my clumsiness. Mia and Jake were back at their VR station, their nervous system project, ready to scare more unsuspecting victims, though they kept stealing glances at me like I might spontaneously combust. And me? I was trying to blend into the background, my coffee-stained shirt a badge of shame, praying I could get through this night without breaking anything else. But let's back up a bit, because the road to this moment was anything but smooth. After racing downtown for coffee, compromising on a blend, and surviving a tense encounter with Mrs. Larson, we'd poured everything into getting Ethan and Diego's project ready. Ethan had recalculated the ratios to account for the new coffee, his clipboard a blur of numbers and notes. Diego, quiet but steady, had measured and poured with a focus that made me proud and guilty all at once. Mia and Jake had helped with the setup, cracking jokes to keep the mood light, though I could tell they were as nervous as I was. We'd worked until the last possible second, the gym doors opening to parents and judges just as we placed the final cup. Now, the fair was in full swing. Judges in crisp blazers moved from table to table, clipboards in hand, asking questions and scribbling notes. Parents beamed, snapping photos like they were at a graduation. Students stood straighter, their voices a mix of confidence and terror. I hovered near Ethan and Diego's table, not quite part of their presentation but unable to walk away. Told myself I was there for moral support, but really, I was terrified of what might happen next. What if the judges noticed the coffee wasn't consistent? What if Diego tripped over a stray cup and got soaked again? What if I sneezed and knocked the whole table over? My brain was a parade of worst-case scenarios, each one more ridiculous than the last. Ethan and Diego, though, were in the zone. A judge approached. A stern-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, and Ethan launched into their pitch like he'd been born for this. "Our project explores dilution and concentration," he said, his voice clear and steady. "We used coffee and milk to demonstrate how molecular interactions affect flavor and chemical properties." Diego chimed in, explaining the setup, his English careful but confident. I stood a few feet away, my heart pounding, watching them field questions like pros. The judge sipped a cup, nodded, and jotted something down. I held my breath, waiting for the verdict, but she just moved on to the next table. No explosion, no disaster, just science. For a moment I thought we'd done it. We'd pulled off the impossible, rebuilt the project, and survived the first wave of scrutiny. I even let myself smile, a flicker of relief breaking through the guilt that had been choking me all day. But then, because the universe loves a good plot twist, I heard a voice behind me. "Mr. T, can we talk?" It was Principal Carter, her expression unreadable but definitely not happy. My stomach dropped. I followed her to a quiet corner of the gym, my mind racing. Was she going to lecture me about responsibility? Suspend me for reckless VR flailing? Make me write "I will not ruin science fairs" 100 times on the whiteboard? She crossed her arms and I braced myself. "I heard about what happened," she said, her voice low. "The VR, the coffee, the whole mess. Care to explain?" I opened my mouth, ready to spill the whole pathetic story, but something stopped me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Ethan, Diego, Mia, Jake, the kids who'd worked their butts off to fix my mistake. So instead of groveling, I straightened, up and met her eyes. "It was an accident," I said. "I got startled during a VR demo and knocked over Ethan and Diego's project, but they stepped up. They rebuilt it, even when I messed up their coffee supply. Those kids are incredible, and I'm just trying to make it right." Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly, like she hadn't expected me to own it. She nodded, her expression softening. "I see. Well, I'm glad you're supporting them, but let's try to keep the gym disaster-free from now on, okay?" I nodded, relief flooding me, and she walked away, leaving me to exhale a shaky breath. Back at the table, things were heating up. Another judge had arrived, this one a cheerful guy who looked like he genuinely enjoyed science fairs. He asked Ethan and Diego to walk him through their process, and I watched, amazed, as they explained their calculations, their testing, even the last-minute adjustments. Diego, who'd been so quiet after the spill, was now animated, gesturing to the cups and describing how they'd standardized the milk. Ethan backed him up, his clipboard a prop for their seamless teamwork. The judge laughed at one of Diego's jokes, a small thing about coffee being his mom's superpower, and I felt a lump in my throat. These kids weren't just surviving, they were shining. But here's where it got real. As the judge moved on, Diego turned to me, his eyes steady. "Thank you, Mr. T," he said, his voice soft but clear, "for helping us fix it." I blinked, caught off guard. "Diego, I'm the one who ruined it," I said, my voice cracking. "You don't owe me anything." He shook his head. "You didn't give up. You went to get the coffee. You stayed." Ethan, overhearing, nodded. "Yeah, it sucked, but you didn't bail. That matters." I stood there, my chest tight, trying not to let my eyes water in the middle of a high school gym. All day, I'd been drowning in guilt, convinced I'd failed these kids. But they saw something else. Not the idiot who flailed into their table, but the guy who stuck around, who ran downtown for coffee, who cared enough to try. It was the kind of moment that makes you rethink everything, like a page turning in, a book you thought you knew by heart. The science fair rolled on, and Ethan and Diego's project didn't just survive, it thrived. They didn't win first place. That went to a kid with a solar-powered water purifier because of course. But they got an honorable mention, and the judges praised their resilience. Mia and Jake's VR project earned a nod for creativity, though. I noticed they dialed down the jump scares for the rest of the night. The gym emptied out, parents and students heading home, and I lingered, helping clean up the last of the cups and posters. As I drove home, the day replayed in my mind. The VR monster, the spilled coffee, Diego's soaked shirt, the race for supplies, the judge's nods. It was a mess, no question, but it was also something more. It was a reminder that mistakes don't define you. What you do next does. Those kids taught me that, and I'll carry it with me every time I step into a classroom. So yeah, I fucked up today. I turned a science fair into a caffeine-soaked disaster, but I also saw what happens when you own your screw-ups and fight to make them right. And that's a story worth telling.